So tonight we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We have 3 more studies from 2 Corinthians together, and then Mark and I will be co-teaching the next class, which will be based on a book by Brother Aubrey Johnson called The Seed Principle. You might not keep up with this, but every 4 quarters I try to have a class that is dealing with practical matters, and this study would be a practical discussion on laying foundation for a positive future. So that will start in 3 weeks, which means it won't start the 1st of September, which is when we're supposed to start. So I'm having to break my own rule and start the 2nd week of September. I know y'all don't care, but I'm kind of OCD about that. I have to start on the quarter and end on the quarter, or at least go 2 quarters. But I can't do that this time. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. When Anna was about 4 years old and we were living in Romania, she had the habit as we were walking down the sidewalk, and we walked 90% of the time when we were over there, she had the habit of grabbing a hold of little limbs on bushes as we were walking by and stripping all the leaves off of them. And I told her, you're going to do that one too many times and regret it. Well, we came to the United States for me to be the missionary in residence at Faulkner University, and we were walking across campus one day, and we walked by a holly bush, and Anna reached out and grabbed a hold of one of those limbs and regretted it. So she looked at her little hand, her little 4-year-old hand, and she had little pricks on her hand, you know, where the leaves of the holly bush had pricked her. Thorns can hurt. Splinters can hurt. If they're big enough and they're easy enough to see, you can pull them out. Sometimes even pulling them out is painful. But if they're not very big and they're not easy to see, they can be hard to pull out. You may have to get a magnifying glass and a little needle to try to find where it is. I think it was a piece of glass that I had stepped on, but it was in my house shoe, and I would feel with my hand in the shoe. I couldn't feel anything. Feel on my foot, and I couldn't feel anything, but when I stuck my foot in my shoe, I could feel it. And I'm thinking, where is it? So I just kept scratching and scratching and scratching my foot, and eventually the pain went away. What is the one sin you struggle with the most? Now that's a question that's personal for each one of us. What is the one sin that you struggle with the most? In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the text that you're probably already familiar with, Paul uses this concept, this imagery of a thorn, as a metaphor for a weakness in him that he had, which the devil used to try to get Paul to sin. Now, we all have our thorns in the flesh. In fact, we probably have more than one. I was struck with a thorn in the flesh, or I realized I had a thorn in the flesh as early as the 6th grade. If y'all remember Robert Lee, and I share this because he himself made it public, he was, now I can't remember the details now, about 4 or 5 years old when he first got addicted to drugs. Can you imagine that young? It's because of his inhaler. He said he realized that if he took in more of that inhaler than he was supposed to, it gave him a sense of a high. And he struggled with that for a very long time. And by the grace of God, he's free of that now. That story is, his story and Danielle's story is inspiring. But now there's been times over the last 3 decades that thorn in the flesh has come back to hurt me badly. And I'm reminded that thorn is still there from time to time. Why does God allow these thorns to happen? Why does God allow these thorns to remain? Why doesn't God just remove all of the thorns in the flesh that we have to make our lives a whole lot easier to live? Keep you humble. Isn't that the message of this text? That answer is found in this text that we're going to look at tonight. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 10. Now in this paragraph we have to keep the context in mind, of course. Again, notice in verse 1 that Paul mentions boasting. In fact, in the original language, it's the very first word in the text. New American Standard is also the first word. Once again, the word boast or boasting is found 25 times, 20 verbs, 5 nouns in 2 Corinthians. 20 times Paul uses the verb in these 13 chapters. And most of that concentration is in chapters 10, 11, and 12. 19 times. So this is an important concept in these 3 chapters. And in fact, we have to study these 3 chapters really together. Now, if you look back at chapter 10 and verse 1, Paul says, "Now I, Paul, myself." And that wording shows that Paul is dealing with a new subject in this letter. And that's chapters 10, 11, and 12. The verb boasting and the adjective or noun weakness used over and over again in these 10 verses. 3 chapters. Verse 1, chapter 12, verse 1. Boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable. But I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Now, up to this point, particularly at the end of chapter 11, what has Paul been boasting about? All the trials that he went through to teach the Corinthians, to get the gospel to the Corinthians. The number of times he had been beaten, the number of times he had been left for dead, the number of times he had been shipwrecked. Now, what is unique about Paul boasting in this section, verses 1 through 10? Now, we've not read all 10 verses yet tonight, but what is unique? You know what this section's about. Or at least Tanya does, and if Tanya does, the rest of you do. So what is unique about this section of Paul boasting? It's personal. Personal what? What's he going to talk about? He actually mentions it in verse 1. Visions and revelations. Now, is that something people would brag about? Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's whole denominations today that are based on people receiving special messages from God, right? So bragging about having some kind of revelation from God is something you'd brag about. But we're going to find this bragging is unique. It's different from what others would brag about if they had the same experience. Verse 2. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. Now, what do you know about the third heaven?
Not a whole lot.
Not a whole lot. What are the first two heavens?
Earth is one of them.
Okay, the sky above the earth is one of them. Sun, moon, and the stars would be the other. So what's the third heaven?
Hopefully the place we're going.
The place we're going to when we die. You didn't say we hope, did you?
I did, because I have the hope of eternal salvation.
Okay,
Save myself.
that's right. So the third heaven then would be beyond outer space, right? So in fact, we're looking at where God dwells. And this was a way that the Jews referred to this type of thing. Some Jewish writers actually talked about 7 heavens, but Paul's just talking about the third heaven. And in fact, we have an idea that it's heaven itself as we get further into his discussion. So why does Paul emphasize that he doesn't know whether it was in the body or out of the body? He didn't see it? That he heard?
I think it was important whether he was in or out, it didn't matter.
It didn't matter if it was a literal experience or just a vision. Okay. Well, the truth would be the same either way, right? You remember in Acts chapter 12 when Peter had been in prison and the angel comes and lets him out of prison. As he was following the angel through the prison and then outside, what was going on in Peter's mind? Luke tells us. What was going on in Peter's mind? That's right. He wasn't sure if this was a vision or if it was reality. Until he got outside and maybe it was the cool air or whatever, and that's when he realized, hey, this is not a vision. So none of us have experienced these kind of visions, but apparently a vision could be realistic enough where the person experiencing it didn't know whether or not it was a real experience or just a vision. So Paul says, I don't know if this was a real experience or a vision. When this man, I ask a question in just a moment, why is he talking third person? And in fact, is he talking about himself? We'll ask that question in just a moment. So verse 3, Paul says, I know how such a man, whether in the body or out, apart from the body, I do not know. God knows. Verse 4, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. Where else is the word paradise found? In the New Testament. It's found in Luke 23 and verse 43, where Jesus tells the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. Found here. Yeah, there you go. And then it's found in Revelation 2 and verse 7 where Jesus promises the church in Ephesus that whoever is faithful will eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God. It's the only 3 times the word paradise is found in the New Testament. The Greek paradise, the English word paradise is a transliteration of the Greek word paradisos, which is actually a loan word from the Persians. The Persian word means garden, which might be where some people refer to Garden of Eden as a paradise because paradise means garden in the Persian language. So in Luke 23 and verse 43, Jesus says to the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. Okay? Peter says in Acts chapter 2 that Jesus went into Hades. So there's a part of Hades that is a good, pleasant experience that Jesus could refer to as paradise. But then by the time we get to the book of Revelation, chapter 2 and verse 7, the word paradise, garden, is being used in reference to heaven itself, where the tree of life is found, which is also pictured as a garden in Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 through 5. So this paradise that Paul is caught up to here surely is the dwelling place of God, if we could use the verb to dwell in reference to God. So he says, I was caught up into paradise and heard, actually he says this man was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. Now, why wouldn't someone be permitted to speak these experiences? And this is speculation, but why? Why do you think? Wasn't time for it? Any other guesses? God didn't want him to. That's the bottom line.
Could be something that would be very frightful to the people on earth.
Maybe frightful.
Or, as we spoke about when we talked about the Lord, maybe this is something that God doesn't want us to know.
Maybe it's something God doesn't want us to know about because it could motivate us in a wrong way. If there are, in fact, degrees of rewards and punishments, maybe it would motivate us in an envious way. I don't know, we're speculating. I just don't think, and I'm not going to open up a can of worms here, so we're not going into this discussion very far, but I just don't think God allows people to have out-of-body experiences. I just don't believe it. I've got a book written by a surgeon named Eben Alexander that I read just a few years ago, where he claims to, number one, have been a skeptic, and number two, to have experienced an out-of-body experience. And he goes back and writes his book. Don't want to judge his motives, but I don't believe it. I don't know what he experienced. I don't have to understand what he experienced. I don't have to believe his story. All I've got to do is believe and defend this book right here, and that's it. And I don't find any reason, any evidence that in this book that God would have somebody go into the afterlife and then come back and tell people about it. God gave Paul a vision of the afterlife and then told Paul, don't tell anybody about it. Now, as to the why God said not to, in Paul's case, my opinion is it would have helped Paul be more prideful if he was able to talk about what he saw. And we're going to find beginning in verse 7, where Paul says the reason why God allowed Satan to inflict him with this thorn in the flesh is because of these revelations he was receiving. And so I speculate that God did not allow him to talk about it for that reason. Number one, I think it was given to Paul to encourage him despite the problems, the persecutions, and things he was experiencing for the name of Christ. God gave him this special revelation, but then God held him back from telling people about it to help humble him. Any thoughts on that before we go on to the next verse?
But John, even in Revelation, as he describes it, says, I'm going to try to describe it, but he can't adequately put it in words, I think. But he can adequately describe what he's seen in words.
How would you describe heaven? Exactly. Now, if John had been a 21st century American and God had given them this revelation of heaven, it probably would not be described in the way it is in the book of Revelation. John was writing to Jewish Christians in the first century, so he wrote it in terms that they would understand. And in fact, Bernie's reading a commentary on the book of Revelation, and that commentator said that there are over 400 references to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. Why don't people understand the book of Revelation today? Because we don't understand the Old Testament. We've gone all these years saying, let's just preach the New Testament. Let's just preach the New Testament. Okay, we get to the book of Revelation and we're as ignorant as dirt. Why? Because we don't want to study the Old Testament. So Paul says, this man, he's still speaking third person, but this man had this revelation, and God said, don't tell anybody. Verse 5, on behalf of such a man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast except in regard to my weaknesses. Now, how would you paraphrase this verse from verse 5?
Don't judge me on this, judge me on what I do, or on what you see.
Okay. On behalf of such a man, this man that has seen this vision of heaven, I'll boast. I'll boast about that man. But I won't boast about myself except in regard to my weaknesses. So I think now we understand why Paul is describing this experience in the third person, so that he could try to separate his boasting, and I put that in quotation marks, from the experience that he had. Because he's not trying to elevate himself, is he? Those super apostles in Corinth would be elevating themselves if they had had this experience. And Paul's not trying to elevate himself. He's trying to relate to the Christians at Corinth to show that he's not a nobody. He is an apostle of Christ. That's what he said back in chapter 1, verse 1. But despite this great gift that God has given him, having a vision of heaven, at the same time, God gave him this thorn in the flesh. And that's why he says, I will boast in my weaknesses, verse 5. So Paul is having to walk a thin line. I felt like I was walking a thin line in my sermon Sunday morning. I don't want to offend a bunch of men in the congregation, right, by giving us a punch in the stomach by saying, hey, pull your man card. But what I do want to do is challenge men, right? I want to challenge men. Step up and let's get to leading. So where do you cross over the line from stepping on toes to challenging? So Paul's having to walk the thin line here between explaining something that most people would boast about, but doing it in a way that really illustrates his weakness, not this wonderful gift that God has given him. So verse 6, for if I do wish to boast, I will not be foolish, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from this so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. So why will Paul not boast?
Well, for one thing, everything he's got is from Christ, and he's always putting Christ before himself.
Right. So again, his detractors in the church at Corinth, they're wanting to draw glory to themselves, right? And that's not Paul. Paul is wanting to send the glory to Christ. And that's what he says later on in this one paragraph, right? All the glory belongs to Christ.
He's not saying I'm special, so God bless me. He's trying to tell him I'm just a weak man like you. God has sent the message and I want you to have it too.
Right. I am a weak man just like you. But through my weakness, Christ accomplishes his will. So verse 7, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations. So I think we're very safe in saying that the man who was caught up to the third heaven is Paul. And he says it was 14 years ago, which would actually put it at the time right after his baptism when he went to Arabia. That's Acts chapter 9. So around that period of time is when Paul had this special revelation from God. And in verse 1, he says, I'm going on to visions and revelations of the Lord. In verse 7, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, and he'll use this verb twice in this one verse, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Boy, anytime a Bible writer repeats himself, that's a sure sign that there's something significant going on here. So with the surpassing greatness of his revelation, why did God allow Paul to have this thorn in the flesh?
Keep him humble.
Keep him humble. Now, what's your thorn in the flesh?
His or mine?
Yours, but I'm not asking. You don't have to tell me. But what is your thorn in the flesh, or thorns, plural? Why can't God just pull this sinful desire out of my heart? Why won't He just pull that sinful desire out of my heart and get rid of it entirely?
Mostly, so we still need God.
To help us show that we still need God.
Otherwise, it's like, yeah, I can do it.
I can do it on my own. Yeah, that's not true, is it?
Lets us know God's in charge too.
It lets us know God's in charge.
We have to go to Him when we do dumb things, basically.
We got to go to Him for.
Thorns that we have, we know that we need to ask Him, and that's what He wants us to do.
So we've got to go to Him to remove the thorn or the consequences of the thorn. We've got to go to Him for forgiveness. Right? All strength comes from Him. The encouragement comes from Him. The idea that we're going to have forgiveness, the idea that we have that hope in heaven.
And do we trust
And do we trust
Him?
in His forgiveness? Now, what does Paul call this thorn in the flesh? That's what I was looking for. The messenger of Satan. The angelos of Satan, angel of Satan. Same word. Here it'd be better translated as messenger. This thorn in the flesh is a messenger of Satan. And what's the result of this thorn in the flesh? Well, I'm looking for that other word now. To torment him. That's the result of it. The purpose, now here we can distinguish between purpose and result. The purpose is to humble him, to keep him from exalting himself above what he should. The result is that this thorn in the flesh torments him. Does your thorn in the flesh torment you? If you're a faithful Christian, I suppose it does. God allows Satan, He allows Satan to torment us with these thorns that we deal with to keep us humble.
Even if it's a physical thing that you can't change, turning to God helps you to cope with it, just to deal with it and go on.
Right.
I mean, some things you have to fight to overcome, but if it's something you can, you just learn to deal with it.
Yeah, okay, so I've been using spiritual thorn in the flesh. You're suggesting we also deal with physical thorns and physical problems or something else, other types of weaknesses that may not be inherently sinful. Paul actually had to deal with, apparently, with not being a good speaker, right? At least that's what the Corinthians were criticizing him for. I don't think that's his thorn in the flesh, but it's something he had to struggle with.
Didn't he have a bad eyesight? I mean, because he wrote with big letters, I mean, people say he had bad eyesight.
Right. We've got two, and
People think that's the thorn too, I don't.
yes, I gave those passages last week, actually, from the letter of Galatians, where he tells the Galatians, some of you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me, which suggests maybe he had eye problems. And he also writes in Galatians that he writes with large letters, which might be from him working with leather so much and him having big fingers. How many of y'all have problems typing on a cell phone because your fingers are too fat? I won't mention Mark's name, but he has problems. All right, so the thorn in the flesh. Now, how many times does Paul pray and ask God to take away that thorn in the flesh? Verse 8, concerning this I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. Not to give up. It also shows sometimes God's answer is still no.
14 years, 3 times.
So that's what, once every 5 years?
Yeah.
So he didn't pray that often, is that what you're saying?
Didn't pray about that.
It's nice for God to say, all right, no, let's get on with it.
Yeah. Yeah, he doesn't, but God doesn't give us those kind of answers, does he?
Can I just, I want to say what I think the thorn is.
Okay.
I mean, just to throw it out there, because it just crossed my mind that it might be, since you were talking about spiritual things,
Mm-hmm.
we know what he was before he became a Christian.
Right.
He was a very good Jew is what he was.
Right.
But he regretted that once he became a Christian. Maybe that's his thorn, and the devil keeps reminding him of how bad he was to the Christians before that.
Yeah.
I just had to say that because I've never thought of it that way before.
Yeah. How he treated Christians and or what he could have been if he had stayed in the Jewish religion.
Yeah, he gave up a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. While we're speculating, one opinion's as valuable as another. Yeah. So he prayed 3 times. Cody says once every 5 years. Once every 60 months, he asked God to take this thorn away. Marvin. Okay, so 3 times in day 1, and after that he just dropped it.
He never thought about it.
Okay, the point though is that he prayed to God more than once, right? Isn't that the point? And God says, verse 9, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. So what was sufficient for Paul? God's grace. Is God's grace sufficient for us? Is God's undeserved favor sufficient for us? If we've got our weakness over here, whatever the weakness is, and maybe it's not a sinful weakness. Maybe it's just something that you would like to be able to do, but you can't, either physically or intellectually or whatever. You got this weakness over here. Is that where you focus your energy? Or do you focus your energy on the strengths that God has given you by His grace? And do we recognize that the strengths we have are by the grace of God? 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 7, the Holy Spirit has divided up gifts as He wills. Those aren't necessarily miraculous gifts. They're gifts that God has given us. So God says, my undeserved favor is good enough for you. That's sufficient. Whose power is perfected in Paul's weakness? Christ's. So why does God allow us to struggle with these weaknesses? We've already answered that. To help us grow stronger and to realize the strength comes from Christ. We don't save ourselves. We will not be able to live sinless lives, contrary to what you're studying the your Genesis class. We will not be able to live sinless lives. We're always going to have some thorn in the flesh. We may be able to conquer some of them, but there's going to be something that's going to plague us until we die. Why? To help us realize until the day we die that we're not going to heaven by our own power. We're not going to heaven by our own strength. We're not going to heaven by our own goodness because there's not enough of it. It's by the strength of Christ. So why does Paul boast in his weaknesses? Verse 9.
So the power of Christ will be in him.
So the power of Christ will be in him. If my heart is full of Paul Holland, then where's the room for Jesus? Not any room. Not any room for anybody else. So Paul says, I received this revelation of God. But for those of you in the church at Corinth who would be bragging about such a thing, I can't brag about it because God told me not to. But on the other hand, He gave me this thorn in the flesh that's tormenting me. And I asked Him 3 times to remove it, and He said no. Be satisfied in my grace. And so Paul says, there you go. I'm going to boast in my weaknesses. The weaknesses that I just spent 10 verses in chapter 11 going over. That's what I'm going to boast in. I'm going to boast in not being the first Roman soldier to scale the wall. I'm going to boast in having to run for my life, being lowered over the wall by some friends under the cover of darkness. But it was all about sharing the gospel of Christ so that you knuckleheads could hear the gospel and be saved. Don't you think he called them that in his head? I think so. That kind of...
Though these people were, idol worshipers and everything else, and they were one of the biggest seaports in the world at that time, and they were living on their own for so long, and then Paul came in and said, this is the way you need to do it. And they went, you're right, but they still had all that stuff in the back of their head.
Yeah.
So it took them,
Yeah, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, and when you've been living your life for yourself.
a lot of old tricks in there.
Yeah. All right, last verse for our discussion tonight, verse 10. Therefore, what are you supposed to do when you see the word therefore?
Add it to the stuff you do.
Look and see what it's there for. It's drawing a conclusion. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecution. Notice how he adds the preposition. You got to read the Bible closely. Notice how he adds the preposition in front of every single noun. And the reason he does that, I think, is to slow you down and think more deeply about what he's talking about. So I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties. That list I gave you back in chapter 11. For Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So what was Paul's attitude about all those things that he had experienced, all those bad things he had experienced? What was his attitude about it?
He was happy.
He was happy, content. God was with him the whole time. Made him stronger. Look again back at chapter 1. Look back at chapter 1, verses 8 through
He said he counted all of these
8 through 10.
Remember, he said he counted all of these things for righteousness.
Yeah. So chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, we don't want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction. He talked about it in chapter 11. He just finished talking about it here in chapter 12. Which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life. We thought we were going to die. And indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves so that we would not trust in ourselves. Isn't that what we just spent the last 40 minutes talking about? That we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. If my weakness causes death, that's fine. God's going to raise me. If insults cause my death, that's fine. God's going to raise me. If distresses cause my death, that's fine. God's going to raise me. If persecutions cause my death, that's fine. God's going to raise me. If difficulties cause my death, that's fine. God's going to raise me. Where was Paul's faith? Where was his trust? It was in God. Verse 10. God, who delivered us from so great a peril of death and will deliver us, He on whom we've set our hope, and He will yet deliver us. That's why He boasted in the strength that Christ gives. So what is the advantage when we recognize our weaknesses? Realize how God is helping us, how God strengthens us, how God encourages us, how we're able to accomplish good despite our thorns.
In the first chapter, we also talked about part of it so we could comfort each other.
Yep.
You know, I had this weakness, this is going to happen to you. I can help you through it. I survived it, you can survive it, kind of just.
Yeah. Comfort one another with the comfort with which you have been comforted by God. Chapter 1, verses 3 and 4.
I think too, when we realize the weaknesses that we do have, then we know what we need to ask God to help us with too.
Right, and that requires humility, right? We got to recognize our weaknesses so we know what to pray for. This is speculation also. Why do you think God didn't have Paul reveal what his thorn in the flesh was? We speculated. We've got some good suggestions, but God could have easily told us. Why didn't God tell us? It's personal. Okay, so the anonymity behind his thorn in the flesh makes it easier to personalize it, right? If we in fact knew what Paul's thorn in the flesh was, then we might say, well, I don't suffer with that, therefore my problem is worse than Paul's.
Right.
And He wanted us to be able to disagree about what the thorn was and still love each other.
He wanted us to be able to disagree about what the thorn is and still love each other. There's more than one thorn. What was that about, a sense of humor?
God has a sense of humor, he just wants us to speculate.
Yeah, so God's in heaven listening to our Wednesday night Bible discussions about what the thorn in the flesh is. Yeah, no. Thorns in the flesh remind us that the power of salvation comes through Christ. And when we recognize our weakness, then we can appreciate His strength. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments? Geneva, you got any snide remarks you want to make? Not tonight. Okay. All right. We'll pick up with verse 11 next time, and we'll have 2 more Wednesday nights in this study. We are dismissed.